Hello, and welcome to this bonus edition of Don't Miss This. I'm your host, Jennifer Garrity. Today we're heading about an hour and a half away from Paris by train to Auvers-sur-Oise. Famously, this is where painter Vincent van Gogh spent his final days. In light of this, the village has created the festival Les 70 Jours de Vincent à Auvers, or the 70 Days of Vincent at Auvers. Vincent moved to Auvers on May 20th, 1890. He had spent the previous year in Saint-Rémy-de-Provence, where he'd cut off his ear after an argument with Paul Gauguin, been diagnosed with epilepsy, and been admitted to an asylum. On the advice of Camille Pissarro, Vincent's brother Theo recommended Dr. Paul Gachet in Auvers to Vincent, who moved into the Auberge Ravoux, thus beginning the last 70 days of his life. Dr. Gachet, who had counted Paul Cézanne, Edouard Manet, Pissarro, Charles-François Daubigny, and Auguste Renoir among his patients, advised Vincent to paint as much as possible, and Vincent kept up an almost manic pace, creating nearly 80 large paintings and 33 drawings in those 70 days. He also kept up a continual correspondence with Theo, their sister Wilhelmine, and their mother. This is the perfect segue into the current temporary exhibit at the Musée Daubigny, which features these letters and the sketches they contain, as well as reproductions of the final pieces. Many of these locations still exist in town, but I'll cover that in my next video. The day after he arrived in Auvers, Vincent wrote to Theo and his wife Jo, saying things like, quote, "Now I have a study of an old thatched roof with a field of flowering peas and wheat in the foreground and hills in the background. A study that I believe you will like. It's very colorful here, such pretty bourgeois country houses. There's a lot to draw here. Auvers is decidedly very beautiful, so much so that I believe it will be more advantageous to work than not to work against all expected odds. My dear, upon reflection, I'm not saying that my work is good. It's the least bad thing I can do. Everything else, relationships with people, is very secondary because I don't have a talent for it. I can't do anything about that. As for my illness, I can't help it. I'm suffering a little these days. It's because after my long seclusion, the days don't seem like weeks. But work is progressing a little. Serenity will come. Be that as it may, I don't regret coming back, and things will be better here." End quote. On May 25th, Vincent writes that he has met Dr. Gachet. In his letter, he says, quote, "In the end, I readily believe that I will end up being friends with him. He also told me if melancholy or something else becomes too strong for me to bear, he could do something else to reduce the intensity, and that I shouldn't be embarrassed to be frank with him. Well, that moment when I need him may certainly come, but so far so good, and it can get even better. I still believe it was mostly a midday disease that I caught, and that coming back here will be enough to clear it all up." End quote. In a letter to his sister on June 5th, Vincent describes his portraits of Dr. Gachet. Quote, "I do not seek to make us look alike by photographic resemblance, but by our passionate expression, using through expression and exaltation of character our science and modern taste for color. Thus, the portrait of Dr. Gachet shows you a face the color of an overheated brick and tanned from the sun with red hair, a white cap, and a landscape surrounded by a background of blue hills. His clothing is ultramarine blue. This brings out the face, making it paler despite being brick-colored. The hands, like midwife's hands, are paler than the face." End quote. Dr. Gachet's son wrote this, quote, "This Saturday, June 7th, Vincent came to put the finishing touches on father's portrait. After this brief final session, Vincent did not leave. Having noticed upon arrival that the acacias in the garden were suddenly in full bloom, he went to plant his complaining easel below, not in front of the motif. He therefore had no distance. It was really curious to observe. Before affixing a few touches of color to the little canvas, he threw his head back each time to contemplate with half-closed eyes the flowers below him. At the same time, the sky on both sides was barely visible through the dense foliage." End quote. During his time in Auvers, Vincent also deepened his love for portraiture. From that same June 5th letter to his sister, quote, "What fascinates me the most, much, much more than anything else in my profession, is portraiture, modern portraiture. I seek it through color, and I am certainly not the only one to seek it in this way. I want, you see. I'm far from sure that I can do it, but anyway, I'm aiming for it. I want to do portraits which a century later appear to the people of then like apparitions." End quote. While he was there, he painted 3 portraits of Auberge Ravoux, the innkeeper's 13-year-old daughter. She was interviewed years later. In the interview, she says she only sat for him 5 or 6 times and had no idea that he'd ended up painting 3 separate paintings of her. Quote, he was very absorbed, drawing on his pipe without stopping, in a veritable cloud of smoke. I posed in the back room. Van Gogh often left in the morning for the landscape, and in the afternoon, he often stayed there to finish his canvases, which he then put on the walls to dry. His painting of me frightened me a little by its violence, and I did not find it resembled me. It was only much later that I realized, looking at the reproductions, that he had been able to guess in the young girl the woman that I was going to be. End quote. From his letter to Theo and Joe on July 10th, quote, coming back here, I still felt sad and continued to feel the storm weighing that also threatens you. What to do? You see, I usually try to be in a good enough mood, but my life is also attacked at the very roots. My step is also shaky. I feared, not completely, but a little nonetheless, that it was dreadful for you, my being your dependent. But Joe's letter clearly proves to me that you feel that I'm working and struggling like you. Coming back here, I went back to work. The brush, however, almost falling out of my hands, and knowing well what I wanted, I have since painted 3 large canvases. These are immense expanses of wheat under cloudy skies. And I didn't hesitate to try to express sadness, extreme loneliness. You will see that I hope shortly, because I hope to bring them to you in Paris as soon as possible, since I would almost believe that these paintings will tell you what I cannot say in words, what I see that is healthy and fortifying in the countryside. End quote. In an unfinished letter to Theo, dated July 23rd, quote, I would like to write to you about many things, but I feel that it is useless. My dear brother, I tell you again that I will always consider that you are something other than a simple market for Corot, that through me you have your share in the very production of certain paintings, which even in the debacle you keep calm. Well, my own job, I risk my life, and my reason has melted in half. Fine. But you are not in the selling of men. As far as I know and can take sides, I find you really acting with humanity, end quote. This letter was found in Vincent's pocket. Theo marked it with pencil. Quote, letter he was carrying on July 27th, the day of the disaster, end quote. On July 27th, 1890, Vincent spent all day painting what would become his final piece, Racines, or Tree Roots, painted just around the corner from the Auberge Ravoux. In the evening, Vincent walked a few minutes outside of town into a wheat field and shot himself in the chest. Somehow he missed all major organs. So he made his way back to the auberge. From the small downstairs window, the innkeeper saw Vincent head upstairs, but did not notice any blood or anything notably wrong. When Vincent did not come down to dinner, as was his custom, the innkeeper went upstairs and found him in his bed, bleeding profusely. They ran to get Dr. Gachet, but when he arrived, he declared Vincent too wounded to be moved, too hurt to be saved. Vincent's dying wish was for his brother, and the artist staying in the room next to him rushed to Paris to get him. Theo returned to his brother's side and stayed with him until the end. Vincent died around 1:30 in the morning on July 29th. He was 37 years old. You can visit his old room in the Auberge Ravoux, although photos are not allowed out of respect. Due to the superstition surrounding suicide, all the furniture in the room was burned, and no one has ever stayed in it since. It remains a bit of a mausoleum, and being in the space felt incredibly emotional. On July 30th, Vincent was buried just outside of town in the cemetery surrounded by wheat fields. 6 months later, Theo also passed away and is buried next to him. The cemetery and the Auberge Ravoux are open year-round, but les 70 Jours de Vincent à Auvers at the Musée Daubigny will be open through September 17th, 2023.